As a mother, wife, and divorce attorney for over 15 years, experience has taught me a lot about how to deal with times of uncertainty, transition, and facing opportunities for growth. I'm happy you're joining me for this part of the journey. Mental health issues are an everyday part of our lives. There's something that so many of us struggle with. And whether you've struggled with it personally or you know or love somebody who has, you likely know that there's a lot of shame around the topic of mental health. It's not something that we regularly talk about in our lives together. Ryan Casey Waller is a lawyer, he's a therapist and a pastor, and he's also a writer. He's just written a book about depression and anxiety and all the things we don't want to talk about. And he's here with me today to talk about how having these conversations is actually part of the healing process. We need to shed light on mental health issues. Ryan, thank you so much for coming and being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Excited.
First of all, what is the name of your book?
So you almost had it exactly right, and even just describing it. The title is Depression, Anxiety, and Other Things We Don't Want to Talk About. It comes out January 5th, so just in a few weeks. I'm excited, and that's exactly what it's about. Depression and anxiety, but just the entire topic of, what is mental health? What is mental illness? Why do we need to talk about these things? How can we talk about them? So I come at it from the perspective of not just a therapist, but also as someone who is pastor and is a pastor, but also as a co-sufferer. So I make it pretty clear in the book that I'm not only writing about these topics because I've read about them in a book or I've studied them, but I've also very much experienced them as well. So
I love that you use the term co-sufferer, and I've had an opportunity to read your book, and I'm going to tell you it's incredibly powerful. And you open with your own personal story in this process. What does being a co-sufferer mean to you?
Yeah. I wish I could take credit for that sort of like tagline, right? But I would describe myself in many different ways, and the publisher was like, you're a co-sufferer, and it's like, yes. So what it means for me is that, look, I have battled depression and mostly anxiety for probably most of my life. But the reality is I, like so many other people, thought that that's just how I had to exist. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I actually finally sought out, professional help and got with a therapist and started doing the work. And I realized, oh my goodness, like being nervous all of the time doesn't actually have to be a thing. And it's not the case that everybody else is experiencing that. I mean, I think from an early age, I understood that there was something going on inside of me that maybe wasn't going on inside of the heads of my peers. And I thought, well, we're all wired differently. Maybe this is just like my cross to bear, And once I got into therapy and once I got into medication, we can talk about medication later, and got on the right medication, I realized, oh my goodness, there was just something a little bit out of whack here that I needed some help with. And I can literally sort of like look at my life and look at it before I availed myself to the help that's offered in psychotherapy and afterwards. And that's not to say that once I got in there in my 30s that everything was, peaches and cream afterwards. As I describe in the book, depression is often recurrent chronic disease, which means, we don't ever necessarily get cured from it. But the reality is, folks who do seek out help for just kind of your run-of-the-mill depression, if someone seeks out treatment, what we see, according to the data, is a 70 to 80% success rate, which means for 70 to 80% of people who actually seek out treatment, they report a serious and significant drop in symptoms, okay? So we don't necessarily get cured, but we often do get better. So what it means for me is I suffered from these issues, and as I describe in the book, what kind of led me to write this book is I went through a particularly bad period, of burnout, which I can get into that if you'd like me to, and tell the readers what that looked like a bit.
I definitely would love for you to share that with us. One of the, the title of your book, The Things That We Don't Like to Talk About. You do discuss in the book how actually talking about this is so incredibly important. Why is it, do you think, that we don't want to talk about it? What is it in our world that causes us to want to hide these things about ourselves?
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, one of it is that, like, we live in a society that tries to say, look, we can talk about everything, right? We're in this sort of like age of like, nothing's off limits. Well, yeah, there are some things, and mental health is especially one of them. It's such a highly stigmatized issue, right? So I talk about it, in the book. If you were to, break an arm or something like that, that would be something that you might, actually post to social media, like as it's happening, right? Like here I am in the ER, like waiting or whatever it might be. You would share this sort of like tragedy in your life because
Sign my cast.
sign my cast. It's the sign my cast, right? Because not only is it like there's no shame or judgment involved in, oh my gosh, you broke your arm snow skiing. It's like, oh, okay, people are in on this. But it's also like, it'll actually make you feel better because as you're waiting in there in the ER, maybe after they've given you the pain meds, you will see that your phone is getting lit up with notifications of people commenting or liking or supporting you, which is giving your brain, right, sort of that hit of like dopamine, right, of like, oh, this is exciting. It's a way to even like take your mind off the pain. We share our maladies with other people with physical illnesses. Nobody is showing themselves in their bed, unable to get up and go to the restroom because they're so depressed that going to the restroom feels like climbing Mount Everest, right? It's this notion of this pain, this kind of psychic pain, is not the kind that I'm allowed to share because people won't accept it perhaps as easily, and or they feel as though if I share this, I'm going to be labeled and marked as something that is permanent and puts me in a different category. People don't want to be thought of as mentally ill. And there's all sorts of reasons why, historically it's been highly stigmatized. But what I'm hoping to do, and the reason I'm hoping to have these conversations, is because I would love for us to begin to understand and be honest about the fact that this is not a binary issue. It's not as though we have the mentally well and just the mentally unwell, and you're either one or the other. The reality is that mental health exists on a continuum. And we all have mental health. You don't get to avoid having mental health. The way we define mental health, right, is the way your thoughts, right, your feelings and your behaviors, right, affect your actions. We all have mental health. The reality is all of us are either on the spectrum, either closer to being mentally healthy or mentally unhealthy, and we move back and forth during our life. In the same way, who can actually claim at any point in their life that they're physically totally healthy, right? It's like, well, you're somewhere on that spectrum. You might be in the best shape of your life, you've got no sort of chronic conditions, you're young, all these sorts of things, or you may be older, you may have chronic conditions, you may have a terminal illness, and so you're on the other end of the spectrum. That doesn't mean you can't kind of move. And the reality is that's what we do with our mental health. Now, that's not to say, though, that mental illness doesn't exist. So for instance, a person that is suffering from a serious psychiatric disorder, say like, schizophrenia, they might have delusions of reference where, every TV show they watch, every conversation they have with someone, every ad that they see on Facebook, every billboard they see, when they're driving down the freeway, somehow is about them, right? And they believe this, and it makes them more paranoid, and they're terrified, or they're involved in some scheme, right? That's a real thing that could be going on with someone that's suffering from schizophrenia. That a person who's got generalized anxiety disorder that simply is wound up and is nervous about the day, they're not going to experience those kinds of thoughts probably. So there's a distinction there, and it's important to make that distinction. So I'm not wiping out, right, the difference between being mentally unwell and being mentally well. There is a distinction, and they're treated differently. But the reality is these are not frozen, concrete states of being that we've often so thought of them as, which is to come back to your question, why don't we want to talk about these things? Because we still have this general perception that that's what they are. And if I come out and I express I'm going through a depressive episode, right? Or maybe even I have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, then people are going to put me in a box and leave me there. And the reality is, and we've got good data, is that that's probably not going to be an advantageous box for you to be in, right?
Right. Well, in fact, one of the things you address in the book are some of the myths and misunderstandings that people have about mental illness. For example, somebody who's struggling with mental illness is going to be more violent.
Oh, yeah.
And,
that's a big one.
And I really appreciate kind of the description that you use in the book in talking about the varying degrees and the continuum of mental health. What do you think is a real contributing factor to mental health, to somebody who has mental health in their life?
Yeah. So the way that we tend to look at it nowadays, and I think probably the best way, at least right now, maybe in 100 years it'll be different, is we approach mental health and we look at a person, right? Because that's what we're talking about here is people. And if we're experiencing some kind of symptoms, we want to ask, to what degree is this, biological, right? And to what degree is this psychological? And to what degree are socioeconomic factors in play here, right? So often is the case that if someone's suffering from a mental health condition, there might be a biological aspect to this, right? So genetics can be at play. And oftentimes we can remedy the situation, or we can reduce the symptoms dramatically with psychotropic medication, be it antidepressants or mood stabilizers or whatever it might be, which are best prescribed from psychiatrists, if we can get that. So we address the biology. Do we need medication here to maybe rebalance some chemistry in the brain? Often alongside of that, though, is we fail to consider the rest of the biological aspect there, right? What we eat, how we eat it, how much we move, how much we don't move, our patterns of sleep, all the other ways that we take care of our body absolutely dramatically affect the processes of our brain, and we cannot, pull those apart. So we've got to look at it, from a biological perspective. But then also, it's the psychological perspective. What kind of stories, are we telling ourselves, right? So what do we believe, right? This matters immensely for the stories we tell about ourselves and the possibilities, that we have for ourselves. And so part of, the big part of talk therapy is allowing someone to actually externalize what's going on internally with their thought processes of figuring out how is it that I see myself? What is it that I believe is possible? What's impossible, right? How am I processing or not processing the trauma, right, that I've been through? So we get into these thinking patterns. We have healthy thinking patterns. We have unhealthy thinking patterns. And what we're learning and what we understand is that the human mind and the brain is far more elastic than we ever believed that it was. So as deeply entrenched as particular thought patterns can get with people, almost nobody's beyond the pale. We can move and we can shape and we can begin to think and believe new things about ourselves, which opens up new possibilities.
I had a complete aha moment when I was reading the book, and you say something in there to the effect that, it's not just what happens in our lives that determines whether or not, we're going to be healthy, but it's how we think about what happens. So you can have two people who experience the same traumatic event, but simply by the way of how they're thinking about it, they create completely different stories.
Completely different stories.
And one of the stories can be really healthy and can lead to transformation and growth, and the other one can, lead to deterioration, I imagine, is what we see.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we all kind of live our lives and we think, oh my goodness, we're shaped by what happens to us. And that's what, Freud brought that out and said, this is it. And so you're basically kind of like predetermined. Whatever happens to you early on is going to shape the rest of your life. Well, he wasn't quite right about that. It's more, yes, what happens to a person is significant, but it's what we believe about the event that's far more significant in terms of the outcome of our life. So a guy named Albert Ellis, who was a really, really famous therapist, he said, look, this is the ABC of thinking. So in everybody's life, we have what's called the activating event. So that's the thing that happens. That's the car crash. That's the end of the relationship. That's the drinking too much, whatever it is. And then we look at that A and we say, okay, that A determines the C, right? The consequence. So now I'm depressed because the relationship ended, or I'm afraid to drive because of the car accident, or I'm an alcoholic, or whatever that is. But the reality is we're skipping the B. The B is what you believe about that event, which is going to determine the consequence, right? So if the A happens, the relationship ends, and the consequence is that, well, I'm never going to be in another relationship because I'm damaged. Well, why is that the case? Because the person broke up with you, or because you believe that you're unworthy of love? It's the B, right? Or whatever that is that's going to determine the consequence, right? So what's hopeful about this is when you look at your C's, and we think, oh, life is a disaster, or whatever, whatever it might be, whatever tragedy has befallen me is now putting me in this outcome. It's like, no. We can do nothing about A. That's in the past. That happened. But B is fair game.
I love what you're talking about, because I know in my practice, and you and I have discussed this, I work with people who are going through a divorce, and that is a triggering event. That's a definite A, and people have all kinds of beliefs around that. And one of the things I love seeing in my clients is as they go work through that and begin to change their beliefs, and I'm just an observer in this, but they get to reshape that next chapter.
Yeah. And
so many people go on to have an amazing life after a divorce, even though initially they didn't know that was possible.
Yeah.
And that makes total sense.
Yeah.
I love that.
Humans are infinitely resilient. And I talk about this a bit in the book. This term resilience, we often, when we think about the word resilient, what comes to mind for me are people who accomplish extraordinary things, right? So I think about like Tom Brady. He's like in his 40s and he's still like winning like Super Bowls, right? Or you think about people who overcome a great illness or whatever it might be, or survive some sort of catastrophic event and then go on to like make the world a better place. And we think, oh, those people are the resilient people and there's something like special about them. When in all reality, human beings are all resilient, far more resilient than we realize we are. And we know this because when you look at like society in a collective like respect, how do we respond for the most part to great tragedy? Well, we do it most of the time by coming together, by helping one another, and by rebuilding. So you look, the towers fall down on 9/11. What happens is everyone just sort of go into like panic and we just, no. People lick their wounds. We take a moment, we come back together, we rebuild, we move forward. I mean, even think about right now what we're going through. Think about how highly adaptable human beings are showing themselves to be in the face of a global pandemic, right? What at first seems like it's just going to destroy everyone. No, people find new ways, we innovate, we're all resilient. And so what we know, though, is that human beings who practice resilience become more resilient. And so what that requires, though, is a belief about themselves that they can survive, that they can adapt, that the A is never going to be the thing that determines the C, that you've always got the B to play with. And so if you believe that you are sort of infinitely capable of returning, right, of looking at a problem in a new way, if you've got this quality in you, which you do, and if you feel like you don't, you can look out into the world and see how many other humans are able to do it, right? Hopefully that kind of encourages you. Now, here's the thing. When a person on our continuum of mentally healthy is over here and mentally ill is over here, when we're further on the spectrum towards mental illness, our ability to be resilient is vastly diminished. And so this is where mental illness can be so difficult, because people often want to say to like a depressed person, if they don't really understand, they want to say, well, I don't understand. Like, why can't you just sort of like get it together, right? Especially when from the outside looking in, there is no like major A activating event, right? So, the family is fine. You've got a good job, right? You live in whatever it is, like, what's the deal? You have to understand, when a person is locked in a depressive episode or suffering, in their mind, the possibilities of health are not there. That's one of the greatest dangers and just horrible aspects of depression, is that when the suffering is intense, it feels as though the suffering is never, ever going to end. And so the pain, there's no way for the pain to be removed. And this is often, or this is why I think right now, a lot of people in this pandemic are experiencing some of the pain that those of us who suffer from our mental health experience, because there's this question of, when is this going to end? And nobody can tell you. Now, hopefully in the past few weeks, maybe we're beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel. But if you think back on the past year, part of the difficulty of this is if someone would have just said, well, look, everyone just hold on, right? If we can get to February of 2021, like it'll be over. But when the question is answered with, well, we don't know, it feels, well, then like it's never going to end. And the human mind struggles with that. And so that's one of the big differences between, physical illness, where the doctor can say, okay, here's the diagnosis, here's the prognosis, you do X, Y, and Z, kind of give you a rough timeline, you should be somewhere. We can endure that kind of pain. When the issue is, I don't know, we're going to have to keep working on this, something could take time, it's far scarier, right? And so something that I find helpful in thinking about this is if the person is really, really struggling with resiliency, right, and they're really, really down and feeling like they can't come back, something that I have found incredibly powerful in my own life is in the Jewish tradition. They believe in Judaism that there's only one unforgivable sin, and that's the sin of despair. And I find that so powerful, because that is to say, to despair is to give up hope, right? Which is in effect to cut off the ability for God to work, right? To look at a situation and say, I know that there can be no other possibilities, and thus I'll give into that pain. And what I don't want people to hear me saying that, like, hold on, God's going to come in and magically like fix you or cure you. And we can talk about that. But what I'm saying is so powerful in that bit of wisdom is that none of us actually know what's going to happen, right?
It's true.
You don't know.
No.
Like, we even think in a few minutes from now, you and I will still be here talking. We don't know that, right? So trying to predict the future and to say that it's all over is in essence what I think the Jewish tradition is getting at there, is to sort of take on the role of God. And so it takes great humility to adopt that mindset of, I'm going to hold on to hope, and I'm going to choose to believe that I can be resilient because I simply don't. I simply don't know.
I think that's amazing, and I love holding on to hope. I mean, it's such an important message in this time right now, and really in any time, and especially when you're facing difficult circumstances. I know one of the things that I've misunderstood about depression is the sense that, you feel like you don't want to get out of bed. Well, just get out of bed, You feel like you don't want to go to work or be productive today. Well, come on, snap out of it. It's this idea that you can just snap out of it. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that your book does a good job of is really helping understand that, when you're in the midst of depression, you don't have the control system there to just snap out of it. It's not something to just snap out of.
No, it's not. And it's a really important point. Because we invalidate our pain and we invalidate the seriousness of this conditions when we believe that we can just snap out of it. We don't ask anyone to just snap out of diabetes. We don't ask anyone to snap out of a broken arm. We don't ask anyone to snap out of any other physical illness. What we ask them to do is open themselves to the proper treatment and to be kind to themselves and allow themselves the reality of what is happening. That's the first step, and that's why these conversations are so important. There's so many people who believe, right, what I got to do is shove this down and I got to get a grip, and this is all about my own willpower, and I'll will myself, right, to get through this. And what we know is most of the time that doesn't work, right? And the numbers are getting worse, right? Where, when 1 in 4 Americans experiences a mental health condition every year, right? What we know about that, so at least 1 out of every 4 people, that's probably dramatically being underreported. It's probably closer to 2 out of 4, and who knows where we're at now, given the world circumstances that we've been in, given the financial strains and the health, worries, all of it for people. But there is no necessarily snapping out of it. What would be a far more productive conversation for people to have in their head, which is what I'm hoping to foster, is, hey, I think something might be going on here that's actually a common human experience for which there is professional help for, right? So maybe I should call someone, or maybe, like I would any other significant event, express this to the loved ones in my life and get their feedback. What I can promise people is sort of like pretending we're not depressed or denying that we're depressed is a really, really fantastic way to make sure we're depressed tomorrow.
What comes to my mind too as you're talking about this is sort of the dynamic of shame, right? Is that sense that, well, I should just be able to snap out of this. I can't snap out of it. Now I feel worse about myself. And shame makes us want to isolate. It makes us want to hide. And you are talking in your book about how isolation is the exact opposite of what we need to be doing. We need to be belonging. We need to be, working with other people. Talk a little bit about how important community is to
huge.
Healing mental health issues.
I say in the book, remind us that in the Bible, there's one thing we're told is not good, right? God creates the fish are good, right? The trees are good, everything is good. Well, one thing's not good, that the man is alone, right? And thus Eve, right? And we get this picture. It's so interesting that we understand now, both from a sociological perspective and a psychological perspective, how much better human beings do when we're together. It's fascinating to me that thousands and thousands of years ago, a little tribe of Israel also knew this truth, right? That humans are designed to be together in this world. An addiction psychiatrist told me once, he said, when I have people, even people who are really, really suffering in the throes of like life or death situations, he said, if I can get them plugged into a meaningful community, half the battle is won. And I was floored. So here's a guy who's got every sort of resource available to him, the expert of experts. And I'm like, you're telling me that like half the battle is won if you can just find your patient a friend? And he's like, that's exactly what I'm telling you.
Wow.
Right? And so what's wild about it too is that depression often tells us to do the exact opposite of what is most healthy for us. And this is the power of this disease. We need to go out and connect with other human beings and let them hold space for us. And when we're depressed, right, for many people, what our brain tells us to do is, no, nobody wants to hear about it. You're pathetic. You're a failure. You don't even deserve to have anyone listen to you. Don't go waste anybody else's time. Other people have more serious issues than you do. Just stay right exactly where you are because you're not worth it. And oftentimes that's what happens. I say in the book that I'm a therapist myself, and sometimes I find myself resisting even going to therapy or the support groups, that I go to. And it's that same workings of like, I don't deserve it. I don't deserve it. People who suffer from depression, there is a lot of shame sometimes, not just because of the societal perspective that we've talked about earlier, but it's an illness that tells us that it's our fault that we have this too, that we've done something, right, to cause this, in our own lives. And so we feel a great deal of shame about that it's not just sort of an inherited thing or that we went through a difficult life circumstance or whatever it might be, but it's like that we're fundamentally kind of like bad people. I mean, that's the difference between shame and guilt, right? Where guilt can be like a healthy thing. Maybe I wronged you in a particular way. I hurt you and I feel badly about that. Well, guilt helps me because it tells me, you should go to Jennifer and you should like apologize to her and try to reconcile the relationship. And then that's a better outcome. Shame says you wronged Jennifer. You didn't do something wrong. You are wrong, right? Guilt is like you did something bad, maybe you can correct it. Shame is you are bad.
I always use the analogy that I think of guilt as like the stench that it's time to take out the trash, right?
Yeah,
You need to
that's good.
do something. Shame is you are trash.
You are trash.
The belief that you are trash.
Yeah, you are trash. And that's so often the narrative that goes on in a person's mind that's suffering is that literally we don't have value, right? That my life isn't worth anything because if I don't even feel that way about myself, then I can't conceive of how someone else would feel that way about me.
You do a really good job, like you are right now, kind of exploring the lies that are part of our common human experience right now.
Yeah.
And, the lies that have to do with our self-worth and our self-value. And it was funny because when I was reading that, I was like, oh my gosh, I know these lies.
Yeah.
And I think depression is really succumbing to the lies, and where maybe they you're not able to think yourself out of it.
Yeah,
I mean,
you can't.
it really, those lies are your truth that you're living.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Those lies are your truth that you're living. And that's where you often can't think yourself out of it because it's a thinking thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's where it can become so helpful, even if it's not with a therapist. That's why friendships or support groups are so good, because you can take what you're thinking on the inside and put it out there and allow for someone maybe to reflect back to you what it is that you're actually thinking so you can hear it.
Because when we hear it from somebody else, we can recognize it for the lie that it is. I mean, when somebody else tells me, when you sit here and tell me that you struggle with these things, I look at you and go, Ryan, you're amazing. How could you think those things about you?
Yeah.
But when it's our own inner voice, it's really hard to overcome that.
It's really hard to overcome it. And that's part of the reason I wanted to talk about, my own depression, my own instances of drinking too much alcohol, my own anxiety, all of that, because it's so easy, especially in today's age, to kind of write something or come out here and talk when, like, you're seeing me today. Well, things are pretty good today, right? But like, the reality is, like, I've been through stuff. You know what I mean?
You have, and you share that so openly and so honestly in the book. And I really appreciate you opening that part of your life, because you had risen to a level. You were highly respected and highly thought of, and are in different ways now. But you had a fall from grace. That was public.
Yeah, it was public. Yeah. I mean, I tell the story. I start in the beginning of the book of coming to church to preach, intoxicated, and what that led to, in terms of healing. But I was in such a bad place in my life, and where I wasn't handling my own depression and anxiety in the healthiest ways, and was using alcohol as sort of a primary, coping mechanism, which is never, a good thing. And so, I did, and ultimately, resigned from the church and kind of went, on my own path of healing. And there was a part of me that resisted wanting to even talk about that, in the book, because I could certainly sort of stand up on credentialing and it's like, here's, you should examine your own relationship with alcohol, or whatever it might be. But here's the thing about vulnerability, and I do appreciate. I'm not saying for lack of a better phrase, you don't have to go and pull down your pants in front of everybody all the time, right? But when we actually share our stories with other people, as honestly as we can or as appropriate, what that does is it allows for attachment to occur. So if I'm vulnerable with you, or I write about this in a way, in the book, and I put it out there. And if someone responds to that with kindness, or accepts, holds that space for me, what that does is it shows me that there are safe places and I can connect with a person, and then I grow in my strength to face this world. Right? And so the value of actually telling your story, be it in friendship or support group or therapist, is you're giving another person the opportunity to hold you or to hurt you. The risk always is that someone will hurt you.
Right.
But the reality is it's the only path toward intimacy. And when we feel that intimacy, that sense of connection, then we know what God said in Genesis is true. The only thing that's not good is that we're alone. And so when we feel like we're not alone, then we're able to go and face whatever we need to face. And so I thought that if I shared some of my own personal struggles, that might encourage other people to do the same in whatever way they need to, right? And also, selfishly, it's an opportunity for me to maybe even get even healthier. I mean, it's scary as all get out, you know? Because as you say, in the sense there was a fall from grace, and that, like, you know, there's a lot of shame that I felt around. I talk about that in the book, that I don't necessarily feel shameful for getting sick, because I don't think that's helpful. But I do feel shame for, you know, letting people down, or feeling as though, you know, something as sacred as worship, you allowed your illness to affect that. I mean, there's lots of shame that I've had to work through for that, and lots of regret, and lots of, you know.
And one of the things I think that you touch on too is just the understanding that, you know, your illness had a ripple effect. It impacted a community that was much bigger than you.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is, I mean, I think that is the case with mental illness, is where we don't get to live our lives in a vacuum. It's not like I get to, you know, I may break my arm and it impacts me. Maybe if I'm playing on a team, it impacts the team. But mental health impacts are the people that we live in community with in a broader way.
Yeah, nobody lives in isolation. You know, I'm a systems-based thinker. And so I don't even think, you know, there's any mental health condition that is so, like, siloed off to a person. So I think it's so important to understand all the systems that a person are a part of, right? Their family life, their faith life, their friends, like everything. We're all, you know, everything I do, right, affects someone else. It's a lie to think that you exist on your own. It's just not the case, right? Which can be good and bad. This is another one of the lies of depression, is that you think, so even in my instance, I think, okay, oh my gosh, you've had this ripple effect, you've hurt people, or you let people down, you're that much worse, right? and you know, and undeserving, right? So this happens a lot in family units, where the person is, you know, the so-called identified patient or whatever it is, and they just think I'm just a drag on everybody. And the converse is often the case. It's like, no, if you're a part of a community, right, then they love you, right? And no matter what has happened there, right, there's always, again, we don't know what the future holds. We do know if we close ourselves off from the possibility, right, of healing. So if we shut it down and we say, oh, I'm not going to deal with this, I'm not going to talk about it, I'm not going to share, I'm not going to ask for help, then I can tell you what the outcome is probably going to be. But if you go the other way, right,
yeah,
more possibility.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that you address in the book head on is the spiritual aspect of mental health, and how Christians have responded to it, maybe in some unhealthy ways that have, you know, made it more difficult to have a conversation, in part in lack, I think, because of the information that we had. I mean, I think that mental health carries a long period of time where it was thought of as being like, you know, a sign of being possessed.
Absolutely.
It's just a lot of misinformation. But you really call the church to task. And I think that that's an important conversation that we need to have in our faith-based communities in terms of how we think about mental health and respond to it.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah. You know, on one hand, I want to do it softly, because it's not as though, I think in many cases, Christian communities are doing the absolute best they can, right? When I think of most of the Christians, right, that I know, they genuinely love God and love neighbor. And they're not necessarily setting out to try and to marginalize or to shame anyone who suffers, right, from mental health. And I want to make that very clear. At the same time, there's the weight of sort of human history, right, against us that's already done all of this work of sort of like putting it over there as like, you can see how ancient this thinking is even in like the book of Job. If you remember the story, right, the man's life completely falls apart. And one of the questions the friends keep asking is, what sin have you committed that you haven't repented from, right? There's something in your life, right, that you're hiding, and God is like punishing you, right, until you like whatever, right? We have this sort of like ancient thinking oftentimes that when a person is suffering, that it's somehow they've brought it upon themselves. And so I've talked to many Christians who have said, right, when they've voiced their own struggles, they've gotten that kind of spiritual guidance, right, from a spiritual leader, which has made them further retreat from wanting to share because they don't want their faith to be judged, or they don't want to be told, right, you did this yourself. So we've got to like communicate, right? If you're out there and you're thinking this way, no. That's not to say, and this is where sometimes the secular community can get uncomfortable. That's not to say that sin can't be a part of this, right? That we can't make things worse for ourselves, right? There are actions and things that we can do and take that don't promote our own wellness. But beginning from the place of this is like, a spiritual malady, I don't think is helpful. We want to see it from that biopsychosocial approach that I was talking about earlier. Now, we do want to take into account, though, a person's spiritual life. This is important, because to not do so is to not treat them in their totality. So often, so many times, psychotherapists are uncomfortable with the person's spiritual life, and to do so is to do them a great disservice, right? Because if their relationship to God is important to them, or their faith community, that's got to be a part of the conversation. But back to the original question, the church itself has often been too judgmental in the sense of thinking that this issue is stemming from a place of sin, or sort of a lack of piety, or a lack of devotion, or whatever it might be. And we've got to pull ourselves back from that and allow ourselves to have these conversations. We just need to educate ourselves, right? That's the place right now when I say, like, look, I want people to be kind to themselves. The church can be kind to itself here. This is not something where it's like you need to come out and you need to be spanked, right? Let's just recognize, hey, we are supposed to be a place of healing, right? And that healing can take all forms, right? If the gospel is true, then there's no kind of illness, there's no kind of problem that shouldn't be able to come to this place and find rest and find healing. And so part of what our work is to make that conversation okay in the church. To be able to raise your hand to say, I suffer from this, and that does not mean, right, that I somehow don't have faith in God, or that I am sort of, rebelling like in some way in my life. This is just what I have to deal with. And, there's a guy named Matthew Stafford, who for a long time was at Baylor, but he's done a lot of great research on mental health and mental illness, in the Christian community. I cite one of his studies where he wanted to know how many people in Christian communities had been diagnosed with some kind of mental illness, only to later be told by somebody in their Christian community that they didn't, in fact, have that diagnosis. So the setup is someone is diagnosed, right?
Right.
And then they go and they maybe share within their Christian community, and they're like, no, that's not actually the case. What you really need to do, right, is get your spiritual life in order. And the number is escaping me right now, but it was something like, it was in like maybe the 40 to 50% range where, his sample, this had happened to. And when you think about that, there's sort of no other kind of health issue where this happens, where Christian communities tell Christians that their doctors don't know what they're talking about, right? You don't really have leukemia, right?
You're just not praying enough.
You're just not praying enough. That's not to say, my gosh, there's not a lot of wisdom to come from the church that, yes, maybe we should pray more. Yes, maybe we should read our Bibles more. Maybe we should be in worship more. All those sorts of things. All of that can still happen without trying to invalidate the expertise that we're getting.
So the eye-opening for me is that it's not either or. It's not either this is, you're suffering because your spiritual life isn't good enough. You're not praying in the right way. You're not showing up to church enough, right?
Right.
It really is a partnership that the church and the medical community should be working together to help people. Because you've got the biological piece, but then you also have the spiritual life, which for somebody who is a believer can be a huge part of their journey to health.
I love the way you put that. It's not either or, it's and. When I was at the church, something that would often happen is people would come to me and they would come when things were like really bad, like the drinking was really out of control, or they'd been depressed for a really long time or whatever, and they would come and they would express this, and and they would want prayer, which is great and fantastic. I was happy to do it. And so often though, I would say, well, hey, have you thought about, going to talk to like a professional? And I was shocked by the level of resistance to that within the Christian community, because people would say, it's not really that serious, or no, that's not something we do in our family, or my family wouldn't approve, or my spouse wouldn't understand. There was this sort of like this belief, I think, that if people went that far, that was somehow renouncing their faith. They felt like it was this either or. It's like, no, I need you, pastor, to pray for me, and I'll stay in church, and that's going to do it. But if I go over here and I surrender myself to inpatient treatment or medication or just regular counseling or just like an AA group or whatever, I'm somehow saying Jesus isn't enough for me. That's not the case. It's and. We are a complex universe unto ourselves, and we need a lot to be healthy, right? Mm-hmm. And to be whole. And I believe that God has provided us all of the resources to do just that. And God comes to us in these many different ways, right? So it's not just about spiritual nourishment in the formal way is critical, right, to life, right? To worship and to be with others and to learn and journey with God. But also, we have to take care of ourselves in the same way that, like, if there's a tumor that needs to be excised out of my body, I allow the surgeon to do that. Right? I don't just hope and pray that it will go away. I pray that it will go away, but I let the surgeon cut my body open and take out the tumor.
And I also pray for the surgeon who's going to be taking
it. And I also pray for the surgeon.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's and that's why I think these conversations are so important in the church. So I don't want people to suffer needlessly. If they're sitting there thinking that is turning my back on God, it is not. It is not. In fact, I'd say God wants you to seek out those resources that are here. God comes in so many different ways. I think I tell the story in the book about how even when I first started taking an antidepressant, I did so for the longest time. I would keep the little pill bottle in my closet, which is like not where I keep the other like medication, right? And it's like I would go in there, it's like, do all this stuff and then go into my closet and take this little like pill and come out. And one day it dawned on me, like, why do I do this? And it was like, this is like literally like closet drinking, but like closet medication. Like, I mean, you can't get more clear of like oh my goodness, right? And it was like, oh, there's a part of me that's ashamed of this. That's what this is. Like, even my wife, who knows I'm taking this, like, it's like I don't want anyone to even like see me do this. And I'll never forget the day I took the little antidepressant and I put it where the rest of my medication is. And in my mind, that was a shift from I'm ashamed of this to I accept this as a resource that God has given me, and this is important to my health, and I'm not ashamed of taking this. This is part of my wellness. It's just a piece of the puzzle. And whether I feel great about that some days or not great about that other days, it is what it is. I'm not ashamed.
Ryan, your stories are so powerful, and I want to thank you for sharing your life. And not only that, but also making resources available. You do a great job in the book of outlining different types of therapy, different types of help. I mean, the book is a personal journey alongside with you, but it's also an incredible resource. And thank you for that. I think this is so important, especially right now.
Well, thanks for saying that. Yeah, and I really hope that the readers will find out. It's I tell some of my own story, but I really want to open the conversation and really point people in the direction where they can find help. And so it's, I hope it's really accessible and practical for people, answering some of these basic questions about how do I know if I'm depressed? What do I do if a friend is suicidal? What's the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist? Give me some examples of these unhealthy thinking patterns, all those things. So I really hope that people people use
And
it
you
as a
also
resource.
tackle big questions like, why does God allow mental illness
Yeah,
to
yeah.
exist? I mean, I love it. You really
Yeah.
don't shy away.
Thanks.
What is your website? If people want to learn more information, where do they go to find out about the book?
Yeah, to find out about the book, go to thingswedon'twannatalkabout.com. You can pre-order the book right now. It's going to be available everywhere January 5th. So you can log on to, if you go to thingswedon'twannatalkabout.com, it'll show you all the vendors that you can purchase from. You can pre-order. There's a book trailer that we just put up for the book. Obviously, you can go to Amazon.
And you're also on social media.
I'm also on social media, so you can find me. Everything is my full name, Ryan Casey Waller. So Instagram and Facebook are where I'm the most active. There is RyanCaseyWaller.com. But yeah, so if you go to social media, that's the kind of quickest way to access probably what I'm up to. So,
Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. It's been great to visit with you.
likewise, thank you.
Thanks.